James sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, but he didn't see the numbers or documents. He closed his eyes. Memories of the past flooded his mind. How had everything fallen into chaos? How had their happy, loving family become strangers to one another? He thought back to his childhood. The ranch wasn't just a place, it was a way of life. It surrounded him from birth. The house, made of light wood, stood on a hill overlooking green pastures. There, the wind played with the tall grass, and the early morning sun painted the world in golden hues. "James, help your father with the horses," his mother called from the porch. Her voice was always soft, but carried strength. His mother, Elizabeth, was the heart of their world, growing vegetables in the greenhouses, baking the most delicious pumpkin pie, and never tiring of her warm smile. His father, Henry, was a man of action. Every morning, he began his day with a walk to the stables. Henry loved his horses, knowing each one by name, and they trusted him in return. To James, his father was a hero, a man who built a world of harmony and love around them. Their family was happy. They dined together on the veranda, laughing, telling stories, and making plans for the future. He and his sister Lily knew their parents had done everything to make the ranch a place they'd always want to return to, but all of that was in the past. James opened his eyes. Remembering hurt too much. His father's death had shattered their world, and from that moment, everything began to fall apart. James sat in his office, surrounded by paperwork and the noise of the bustling city. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his routine. He glanced at the screen and saw his mother's number. "James," her voice trembled on the other end. "Mom, what's wrong?" It's your father. He had a heart attack." She didn't finish, but he already understood. Her voice cut off, and James felt the air leave his lungs. A few hours later, he was driving home. The landscape shifted from gray buildings to the green fields that always welcomed him back to the ranch. But this time, they felt distant, as if they were separating him from home. When he arrived, his sister Lily met him at the door. She looked pale, her eyes red from crying. They didn't exchange words, only an embrace, knowing that words were simply not enough. Their mother sat on the porch, staring into the distance. Her hands rested on her lap, and she seemed lost in her own world. James approached her quietly, but she didn't look up. "Mom, I'm here," he said softly, but her gaze remained vacant. James barely remembered the funeral. He recalled that many people attended and offered their condolences, but it all felt like a fog. He couldn't believe his father was gone, and their lives would never be the same. A week later, the family gathered for the reading of Henry's will. Thoughtfully, he had divided the ranch between James and Lily. The decision was meant to strengthen the family, but no one felt any joy. What once seemed so solid was now crumbling. Elizabeth inherited financial security in the form of investment accounts, but she showed no interest in anything. Once, she spent her days caring for the greenhouses, the store, and the family. Now she was unrecognizable. She refused to meet with friends and spoke little to her children. Most of her time was spent looking through old photo albums or sitting on the porch, gazing at the horses. James felt lost. Seeing his mother's condition, he tried not to disturb her unnecessarily. The responsibilities fell squarely on his shoulders. He understood that, despite the pain of losing his father, he had to take care of his sister and mother. "We'll get through this," he told Lily that evening as they sat at the table. But even he wasn't sure he believed it. James decided to stay at the ranch for a few days. He had a lot of problems to solve. Having grown up on the ranch, he knew how to manage the work, but he had never made decisions on his own. His father was always there, and James could always ask for his advice. Each morning began with the routine that used to bring him joy. James would head to the stables, check on the horses, and talk with the new manager he had hired to make up for his father's absence. The manager, an older man named Ray, was honest and hardworking, but he couldn't replace Henry. Lily was in her final year of high school, but she had to take on all the household chores. Holding back tears, she tried to stay strong, but without the familiar warmth of their mother, everything became even harder. Elizabeth, meanwhile, barely left her room. When Lily brought her tea or food, their mother simply thanked her but remained lost in her thoughts. After a few days, James had to return to work, but he visited the ranch whenever he had the chance. A month passed. A month without their father. One evening when James was home and they were all having dinner together, Elizabeth finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but there were traces of interest in it. I found a support group online, she said, avoiding her children's eyes. People who have lost loved ones. They understand what I'm going through. James glanced at Lily, noticing that she was also surprised. That's good, Mom. Maybe it'll help, he said, trying to encourage her. The next day, as James prepared to return to the city, Lily approached him. Mom keeps talking about someone named Chris. I think he's in her support group, she said, frowning. Do you know who he is? James shrugged. If he's helping her cope with her grief, then fine. What matters is that she's starting to come back to life. Several months had passed since Henry's funeral, but life on the ranch felt frozen in time. James visited every weekend to support his sister and help with the responsibilities that now fell on their shoulders, yet time wasn't healing their wounds as quickly as they had hoped. Lily had gradually taken on responsibility for the store and greenhouses. Her days were meticulously scheduled, mornings spent at school, then harvesting in the greenhouses, afternoons working in the store, and evenings fulfilling orders. James noticed how tired she looked, but Lily never complained. You're taking on too much, he told her one evening as they sat in the kitchen over a cup of tea. James tried to visit the ranch as often as possible, but his job in the city was becoming increasingly demanding. He was glad to see that their mother was beginning to show more interest in life. She spent more time talking with Chris, though it seemed to distance her from her children. Mom's different, Lily said during one of James's visits. They sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee. What do you mean? She only talks about Chris, all the time. And her interest in the ranch and the greenhouses, it's gone. Have you noticed she doesn't even ask how things are going anymore? James nodded, but didn't want to make a big deal of it. Maybe it's just a phase, Lily. She's found someone who understands her pain. Give her time. Lily didn't look convinced, but stayed quiet. A few weeks later, their mother called James with an unexpected announcement. I'm going to Europe for a couple of weeks. Chris suggested we go together. James didn't know what to say. It felt strange to think that his mother, who had never shown much interest in long trips, was now suddenly ready to travel overseas. That's wonderful, Mom. You deserve a break, he finally said, though a faint unease lingered in his mind. When she returned, James visited the ranch to see her. He noticed that she looked refreshed, even happy. I want you to meet Chris, she said. He's coming over with his daughter and her husband. They want to see the ranch. James agreed, though the idea of the meeting didn't excite him. Lily, however, reacted with visible irritation. Mom's living in her own little world, she told her brother. At dinner, Chris seemed like a pleasant enough man to James, though a bit overconfident. His daughter and son-in-law were friendly, but Lily had a different opinion. I don't like them. What could they possibly have in common with Mom? She said after dinner. James brushed off her comments again, but deep down, he was starting to feel the same. One evening during dinner, Elizabeth announced, Chris and his daughter with her husband are moving to the ranch. They want to help me manage things. James froze with his fork midair. Lily, sitting across from him, jerked her head up so quickly that tea spilled from her cup. What do you mean, they're moving in? Lily asked, barely containing her frustration. We've decided it's better for everyone, their mother replied calmly. James and Lily exchanged glances, but chose not to argue at the table. Later, in her room, Lily let her feelings out to her brother. Mom talks about him all the time. He's always here, walking around the ranch like he owns the place. He's even talking about changes he wants to make. I don't believe he cares about us. How are we supposed to live like this? We'll find a way, Lily, James said, though he felt everything slipping out of control. When Chris and his family moved in, the changes started almost immediately. With each visit, James noticed more. The antique chair their mother had cherished as a family heirloom was replaced by a bulky, modern couch, and the kitchen was outfitted with sleek appliances that erased the cozy farmhouse style. Lily couldn't hide her irritation. She felt uncomfortable in her own home. She tried to keep her emotions in check, but her frustration and despair were clear, and James could see her struggling. Chris's daughter and son-in-law weren't as harmless as they seemed. They enjoyed the ranch's comforts, but didn't lift a finger to help. One day, Lily called James in tears, telling him Chris wanted to renovate their father's study, throw out all the furniture and repaint it to make it his own. James tried to calm her, promising to talk to their mother. When he called Elizabeth, she insisted it was necessary for Chris, and she had given him permission. But the changes in the house were only part of the problem. Each visit to the ranch revealed new issues. Their mother's store now sold both expensive organic produce and cheap, low-quality vegetables bought in bulk. Customers complained, but Elizabeth ignored their feedback. When James asked Lily what was going on, she admitted their mother had lost interest in the store. "Chris handles everything," she said. "He hired workers, and now they're using chemical fertilizers in the greenhouses, and they're still selling the produce as organic." James tried to talk to their mother, but she brushed him off. "Chris knows what he's doing," she repeated, as if it were her new mantra. The stables were in no better condition. When James saw their state, he was deeply disappointed. The horses looked neglected, and their stalls were poorly maintained. What would Dad say? He thought. Ray, the stable manager, complained that Chris had cut costs, buying cheap feed and hiring unqualified workers. "I'm doing what I can, but if this continues, I'll leave," Ray said. James couldn't stay silent any longer. He dug deeper into the ranch's finances and discovered that the funds his father had saved were draining away. The savings had been halved, and the business was on the brink of chaos. When he tried to talk to his mother, she flared up. "All you care about is money, James. Can't you see that Chris is trying? He's helping me get through this hard time." But James knew better. This wasn't help. It was the destruction of everything their father had worked his whole life to build. James decided to act. He realized that if he let things continue as they were, the destruction of the ranch would become irreversible. His first stop was a lawyer who listened carefully to the story and suggested conducting a full review of ownership rights and finances. "As co-owners, you and your sister have the right to influence decisions regarding the property and business," the lawyer explained. Meanwhile, life at the ranch continued to spiral. Lily told her brother that Chris was increasingly acting like he owned the place, holding meetings with the workers while their mother merely nodded along. "He wants to shut down the greenhouses for the winter and start buying vegetables from large suppliers to cut costs," Lily said over the phone. "What? That'll destroy everything Mom built," James exclaimed. When he came home for another visit, the tension was even more palpable. Lily told him that Chris had forbidden her from using part of the greenhouse for her floral work, calling it a waste of space. "He said it's nonsense," Lily said quietly. "He told me to focus on revenue, not childish hobbies." James barely contained his anger. That evening he tried to speak with Chris, but the man immediately became defensive. "You don't understand how to run an operation like this," Chris declared. "I'm here to help your mother, not take lectures from a boy." "I see how you're helping," James replied calmly. "My father's savings are dwindling, the business is collapsing, and you're living off everything we've built. That's not help, Chris. That's destruction." Chris didn't listen and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The next day, James gathered his mother, Lily, and Chris around the table. He brought financial reports and showed his mother how drastically their income had dropped. "Mom, if this doesn't stop, you'll have no money or ranch left in a year," he said. Elizabeth pressed her lips together nervously, but Chris interrupted her. This is just a temporary setback. We're all working to improve the situation. Setback? James snapped. This is irresponsibility. Lily and I are ready to take over, but you need to leave. The conversation ended in an argument. Elizabeth left the room in tears. Chris accused James of greed, and Lily sat silently, her eyes downcast. Later that night, James made his final decision. He called the lawyer and asked him to prepare documents to officially limit Chris's involvement in the ranch's affairs. The documents were ready within a few weeks. James and Lily signed them at the lawyer's office, and legally, Chris was no longer allowed to be involved in the ranch's affairs. When James informed his mother, her face twisted in anger. "You threw him out!" she yelled. "Mom, he was destroying everything you and Dad built. I couldn't let it continue," James replied calmly. Elizabeth refused to listen. She accused James of meddling in her personal life and threatened never to speak to him again. Chris didn't give up either. He started calling James, trying to negotiate. "We can come to a compromise," he said. "I'm willing to pay rent and keep you informed if your mom and I decide to make any changes." But James stood firm. "You're leaving. Mom can decide where she wants to live. No one is kicking her out. This is her home too." A month later, Chris, his daughter, and her husband left the ranch. Their departure was met with icy silence from Elizabeth. She left with them, claiming her children had destroyed everything she had tried to build. James and Lily were left alone. At first, everything felt chaotic. There was too much work, the finances required urgent reorganization, and the ranch was in disarray from the previous occupants. But they knew everything now depended on them. James transitioned his job to remote work so he could stay close to Lily. Together, they began to rebuild what had been destroyed. Their first priority was the greenhouses. Lily returned to organic farming and resumed her floral work. James focused on restoring the stables. He purchased high-quality feed and hired new workers who cared about the horses rather than just seeking a paycheck. Within a few months, the ranch started to come back to life. Loyal customers returned to the store, and the horses looked healthy and happy once again. One evening, James sat on the porch, enjoying the quiet, when his phone rang. It was his mother. "How are you doing?" she asked, her voice tired. "We're managing," he replied. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment before quietly adding, "I was wrong. Chris, he's not who I thought he was. He keeps saying I should be grateful to him, but he doesn't do anything himself." James didn't reproach her. Instead, he offered, "Come home, Mom. Lily and I can manage, but you're better off here with us." Several weeks passed before Elizabeth gathered the courage to return. She hesitated, calling Lily and James to ask cautious questions about how the ranch was doing. Lily, though still hurt, spoke calmly, trying not to show her pain. One morning, Elizabeth finally came back. She looked lost as she stepped out of the car. James was waiting on the porch, and Lily stood by the door. They greeted her silently, but without hostility. "You were right," she said at last, lowering her gaze. James nodded, feeling both relief and sadness. Lily, before embracing her mother, said, "We just want you to be part of our family again." Elizabeth broke down in tears, and the three of them spent nearly an hour on the porch, talking about everything and nothing, as if trying to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Her return wasn't easy. Elizabeth struggled to look at the results of Chris's interference. The home she had loved now felt foreign, but James and Lily didn't leave her to face it alone. They helped restore the interior, remove the modern furniture, and brought back the items that had once been so dear to her heart. Elizabeth returned to the greenhouses. Alongside Lily, she began growing vegetables again, rejecting everything that reminded her of Chris's plans. Lily suggested they work on floral arrangements together, giving them a new way to bond. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the family gathered on the porch for dinner. It was a simple meal, but the atmosphere reminded them of the times when Henry was still with them. "Dad would be proud of you," Elizabeth said quietly, looking up at her children. "We're proud of you, Mom," Lily replied with a smile. The ranch had come alive again. It wasn't the same as before, but it was once more a place filled with life, family, and love.